think a good place to start is by asking, has anyone here built a component with React before? All right. So I can do no wrong.
Baby steps.
All right, so I guess the first question, or next question, how many of you guys are using something like Grunt or Gulp in your process? Okay, that I can work with. I am using Gulp, and I use it in combination with something called Browserify to basically create a single file that I load into my application. You can see right here, I write to, actually it's very hard to see that, right there, I write to a file called bundle. That's just basically me mapping out all the dependencies from my file using Browserify, stuffing it into one file, and then I load it on the HTML page. And that basically runs the whole show. I'm just going over this to let you know that here in my Gulp file, this is going to be running in the background while I talk. So as I make changes, this bundle is going to automatically update. And this is just to let you know how everything's running behind the scenes. You can see this little guy right here, transform React file. That takes all your React files, which generally have the file extension JSX, turns them into regular JavaScript. From there, you can then create a single file and not get any errors. So that's just a heads up. The next thing to understand is, though no one's done anything with React, has anybody done Ember? I know you guys had a talk on it at some point. I'm using a router in my application that's very similar to Ember's router. And all this router does is look at the URL in your browser and figure out which JavaScript to run, essentially. So if you look at this, it's a little opaque, but you can see that I have words in here like forecasts, about, and new. Maybe you can see it. Can everybody see it? Okay, good. And you can see over here in the browser, I am on the new page. If I refresh it, hopefully it works. I'm going to go ahead, we're going to build out something that shows weather data on this page. Initially, I had put this guy together. So we're going to start building this thing, essentially, on this new page. So what this really does is it gets a chunk of data from a server I have running in the background. And I'll show you what that looks like right now. So I've got this bad boy running in the background. And I can send requests to it like today, tomorrow, and yesterday. And this is a bunch of data I pull from the Dark Sky API. If anyone has that iPhone app, they operate an API that you can pay to use. I'm building an app on top of that, which is kind of what the inspiration for this talk is going to be. I pulled in the data and I'm hosting it locally just in case I lost internet, is what I was worried about. So now I'm able to access it at this location, and that's really the basis of what we're going to build. So what we want to do is have something like this, where I can select an hour and get the weather for that hour, kind of, for that day. So that's the simple thing we're doing. Okay, hey look, we have a new page. How this works is, here, I name my route new, and the router kind of knows automatically that if you're on /new like this, that name matches with the path. You can also specify the path, but it's not necessary. So here we just have to say the name, and then we tell it, this is the handler. And the handler is really just a React component that we tell it to render onto the page, essentially. And how that rendering happens is, I'll open up new forecast for you. It's pretty simple right now. This is all it is right now. I knocked into your equipment, sorry. Every React component, the simplest it can be is this, pretty much. You must have a render function and nothing else. So at its most basic level, this is a React component. So you can see there are it looks a lot, JSX looks a lot like HTML, but that's what this is called. Got to say that. JSX is basically a syntax that React uses that will, when I bundle it with my Gulp task that I showed you earlier, it becomes JavaScript. So something that looks like this ends up becoming this nested call of functions. So this is going to like translate into JavaScript that can actually get run on your client and produce HTML. It's what?
You see some output?
You see some output? Yeah, totally. So we can go probably find this guy somewhere. Yeah, here he is. Once this guy gets compiled, also feel free to ask questions like that. Once this guy gets compiled, it ends up looking like this. You can see there's my main, there's my actually this is the about page. There's an H1, there's a paragraph, and this null means I'm not passing any options to it essentially. So that's what it turns into, a series of calls to methods on React. And that's what your browser is going to render. So, as you can see, this is actually nested inside this parent route handler, which points to something called app. And if you recall like the Ember talk you guys had, this is kind of similar to Ember in that in your Ember application layout, you have that outlet variable that like just renders everything out in a blob. So the same kind of thing is happening here with this route handler. So once React router, its job is to figure out what goes into the route handler. It's like, I don't know what to put there, so I look at the URL, I figure out that we are on new, and then I render new forecast to the page. That's essentially how it works. So now we're here on our page. You can see it's there. Everybody's happy. The first thing, if we're going to build something that looks kind of like this, the first thing we might want to do is build a select box. So we can.
Quick question.
Yes.
How does running a tool like Lint on that? I mean, that's obviously going to choke. Is it feasible to run it on the output and actually get sensible results from it? Or?
So where you would put that, I think, we hop over to my Gulp file. Any point after this transform takes place, you could actually start linting it, I think, or do whatever you want to do. You might be able to see that I have this Sublime linter tool turned on. It's really hard to see, but it like highlights it in red. As we get more fancy, it's going to get even crazier, and I have not found a good way around this. It's just going to light up your file. But in your Gulp file, after you transform it with this Reactify plugin, it is JavaScript. So as you move down the pipeline, you could then start to lint it and have fewer errors.
And the stuff that React produces is clean for the most part. Okay.
Yes. So it comes out as just regular JavaScript.
But if you get a lint problem, you couldn't fix it in the JavaScript because the next time you did something, it would overwrite it or anything. Wasn't that right?
If you could run into a problem, I think, if there are like two separate classes of problems. I think there's going to be a problem compiling React, in which case you'll get a very accurate line number, because I'm probably going to screw it at some point, you'll see. But yeah, I think there could be a problem if you have like an error and you don't have the source map set up correctly. You can't know the exact line where something went wrong. I've not yet had that happen to me, though. Generally, when I break something, I'm breaking it in one of the functions I'm writing myself, and not so much on the React section. Because React is very strict. React will not, like, let's say I forget to close this. Like, I forgot to close my paragraph. If we look at my Gulp process, you can see it threw up. It can't actually compile that. So it does sort of prevent you from, I guess, making a certain kind of mistake. So that's actually one thing I like a lot about React, is that it sort of forces you to use correct X HTML, more or less. Kind of. Because React can't parse it if you don't format it correctly. So you're going to have a compile error. And I kind of like it. So next thing we'll do is we're going to do is render a select box. So you can see it's pretty much like writing HTML. So what I'm going to do is have my options come back and be rendered here inside my select box. I'm not going to make as many as you would normally see, but I can just start doing this. This should work, if I'm correct. So it's rendered an empty select box? Yes.
So to your point about XHTML, I guess so you are never going to have more like browser issues because everything is expected from React. Is that true?
They try to support down to IE8, and yes, a lot of the incompatibilities with dealing with the DOM are ironed out because React has this entire parallel system that everything sort of runs through. So events run through it. Now, if there are like problems rendering paragraph tags, your floating problems, all of those are going to still exist, But I mean, React can't smooth those out, but it does smooth out a lot of the DOM interaction problems you could have. Because they completely have their own, what they call it, synthetic events. So you're not dealing with browser, what's up, Rob? Snuck in. You're not dealing with browser events. You're never really directly manipulating the DOM, so you avoid the DOM entirely for the most part. You can actually drop in and manipulate the DOM. I've never done it, but there is a way to do it. And a great use case for that could be, I need to add a jQuery plugin. So, like, I need to add a jQuery plugin. How do I do that with React? It's like you can get DOM node, I think is the function. So if you have that, you can then grab it, boom, pop it in jQuery. Yes.
That's the whole point of using React in the first place, right? That you're not directly manipulating the DOM, right?
Correct.
They have the system in place so that it does some smart things on how you're taking the difference between the virtual DOM and the DOM.
Technically, you probably shouldn't use jQuery, but you can if you want. Say, like, if you want to use harvests chosen, which I think is a common use case, you can add that. So now you can see right here that React is pretty smart about manipulating arrays. So what we can do is create a list. Why not? Let's say I just care about the first 5 hours in the day. I have a way more complicated version of this for the main app, but what we're going to do is use map to basically spit out HTML into an array, which is really weird, but it works. So inside our map, also this is sort of a standard thing you'll see, is that people will wrap, whenever they're returning JSX, they'll wrap it inside parentheses, just to say, I think to themselves, hey man, JSX starts here, look out. So this is pretty easy to do. Look at that. There it goes. Oh, I messed up.
This is slash.
Which slash?
If you're in tag of your options and closing out.
Oh, see? Helping me out. I don't normally code on 20x.
Yeah.
So as you can see, it just prevented me from making a syntax error because I was not able to leave that tag open. So, boom, look at that. Now I have my numbers rendering inside a select box. And you can see they're all in here. thing to note, oh wow, cannot see that at all. Zoom in. You can see like React is peppering these data React IP things all in there. That's how React keeps tabs on all the elements it's rendered, more or less. So now we've got this rendering. This is pretty cool, right? We're going to want to add a value. I always get confused on this. Which I think I can do. I think I can do that. No, I can't. You never remember what I can do. Okay, so we should have, yeah, look at that. We got our values in there now. So now it's starting to get a little bit useful. And you can see how I'm just doing this with numbers in a really stupid way, but I think you can start to see how, like, as you receive data from an API, with React it becomes very easy to sort of manipulate the arrays you receive and turn that into markup. So it's like, if I have an array of hours, like let's say I wanted people to select the hours from an API, I could do that. Like I get that array, I can manipulate that into a list. It gets pretty cool, I think. So we'll just stick with 5 hours now. Let's see, the next thing I want to do is I'm going to create what's called a lifecycle event. React has a bunch of these. The one I'm about to write is get initial state. And this is fired when this component is set up. So what, let's see, what's the best way to think about this? So your components have basically 2 places you can pull information from. You have your component's state, your component's props. Right now, we're going to deal with state. So state you can think of more as data which it sort of brings in from places. Props are more like hard-coded settings from someone calling it. So like when I write my own component and I use it, I pass props to it. But your component is going to pull state from a place. Eventually, we're going to get to pulling it from the API. Yeah, what's up?
So does React do away with the traditional concept of a view or template for presentation? Or
they're kind of combined, but yeah,
it's
pretty
like a
much.
controller template thing that's all
Yeah, they call it
notion?
a controller view,
Okay.
which is what we're writing right here. So the controller view is going to be in charge of talking to the API and sort of managing the state for all of its children. I don't think we're going to get to writing very many children, but the more complex ones can get pretty hairy. Because its job is to manage the state for all of its children, more or less. And you'll kind of see what happens. There are ways around it, but we're definitely not going to get into it, I think, tonight. So for get initial state, this is basically going to more or less call set state on your component. You can call this anytime you want, but for the first time, it's best to say return a set of sensible defaults. So for me, I don't know, what do I want it to be? Let's say temp. That seems good, right? So down here, change this to say the weather is. And now we're going to pull that state into our template. Well, not our view. So there you go. We've got the weather at 89. So now I think our next goal, the next thing we probably want to manipulate is talking to the API. Since we're going to, like, this is where it's going to get a little bit crazy because we're going to start talking about Flux at this point. I think this gives you a good grasp, sort of of the basics. But we're about to introduce another lifecycle event. And generally in React, what is it? I think that's it. I don't actually like the names of many of these. Because I'm like, but they'll feel familiar to you, I think, if you've done anything with iOS, because a lot of those views have like So this component did mount as a lifecycle event. It's going to get called when your component has been mounted to the HTML, to the DOM. Isn't that nice? So one thing we can do here is, this is where if you're writing just a React component that's raw, that doesn't need to talk to Flux, you start talking to the API. A lot of examples I've seen is, right here is where you start making your Ajax call. We're gonna kind of do that. But we're gonna need to add a few things. I'm not sure I remember everything we have to add. But basically what we want to do at this point is trigger what's called an action inside Flux. And an action, in this case, is something you can think of it as like something you want to tell the entire application is going to happen. So in this case, we're going to say, hey, load a forecast. So we're going to require our file using the require syntax. So now we have this load forecast thing that we can shoot off. And this is actually where the library I'm using to manage my Flux stuff comes in. I can't remember the exact syntax, so I'm going to cheat. I'm going to pull up the more complex page. This is really what we're after right here. So, this dot props. Now, if you recall, I said props were things that are set by the parent component. And over here in application.jsx, you can see I'm passing in a prop called context. And this context comes from the library I'm using called Fluxible. This was written by the Yahoo guys as their implementation of Flux. And their entire idea behind it was to get you to be able to render a Flux on this, or to render your React stuff completely on the server, and then hand it off seamlessly to the front end, which is why I picked it.
What is Flux?
What is Flux? Flux is an architecture that Facebook uses to design their front end, and Instagram as well. So in normal MVC, you have a bunch of models associated with views, which are normally all handled by a controller, right? So Flux is a little bit different in that it's gonna, actually I have a picture. So that is your Flux flow of information. You can compare it to the MVC flow here. Oh, it's so small. But the reason Flux exists is because Facebook thought MVC was really taxing, and they found they were having two classes of problem with it. One was performance, and the second larger problem, according to a lot of other developers, was they were not able to really hold an accurate representation of their application in their head anymore. It just got too crazy. They couldn't figure out where things were getting set, who was changing what, because they have very, very large interfaces, and things can get changed all over the place. So they came up with this path. What we've been working on so far is this view, this green square. We're about to add an action. That's that load forecast. So your views generally call actions, which get thrown in their pattern. It gets thrown into the dispatcher, which brings data into the store, which your view sort of like gets notified about, and then brings that data into itself. It's very complex. It's really unpleasant to think about. Wait, that's not it. This is it. This is all from my abandoned slides. This is actually what we're going to build. Wow. Can't see that at all.
Maybe you can run through your slides again.
Yeah, maybe, but there are a lot of them. A lot of them. This is the flexible structure, and a lot of Flux libraries have similar setups. We've been working on the view. We're about to call this action, right? So the view can directly call an action, but then an action sort of emits an event through the event pipeline. It's just like a DOM event, right? It's like, I've done something, right? You do something else. In our case, our action is going to talk to an API, pass some data, off to this event pipeline. It's going to basically trigger an event and say, I have data. And stores can listen to the events that actions trigger, right? It's exactly like a click handler or something like that. So the store listens to those. It saves the data in itself, more or less. So it's like compare that to MVC, where you have a bunch of models all sort of like thinking about their own sets of data. Here, there's just one big piece, and everybody sort of asks for chunks of it. So after the store brings that data in, it triggers its own event, which the view is listening for. So the view then asks for the piece of data it wants. In our case, it's going to be the forecast for a specific day. So here in our view, we say, give me the day, give me the info for, I'm just going to hard code it for today, right? So the action asks the API, pass that data into the event pipeline. The store saves today's forecast, and then emits an event that our view is like, okay, now it's there, I can go get it, more or less. So, oh man, I talked for like way too long. Any questions about that, that chart? Because it's a nightmare, I know. It takes a very long time to sort of start to comprehend it, but then after you get used to it, you're like, okay, I can see why this is nice. Because in Match, we have a lot of bugs that come from, where did that data come from? I work in Match, by the way, I think I forgot to say that. In case you couldn't figure out what that last sentence. We're like, hey, where did that data change? I don't know, let's put on our Sherlock hats and go find it. It's very hard. So in React with Flux, you're like, oh, it came from the store, because where else would it come from? Unless you have someone who's mean on your team and is messing things up. Okay, so what were we doing? Oh yeah. So, back to Flux. There's a version called Fluxible, which Yahoo wrote. Fluxible has this thing called context, and it uses that to do everything. I'm not entirely crazy about this syntax either. It's just the quickest way to go A to B with server-side rendering. So you have to call this.props.context.execute action to tell your entire application, more or less, that, hey, do this action. Because actions, remember, can be considered more or less application-wide events. So you say, hey, execute this action, load forecast. Here is the day I want you to look up. And look, I have a bug because I don't have a default day. So I need to add, if I'm going to talk to this .state.day, I should probably add a day, right? That would be good. I use single quotes now. I forget sometimes. So now I'm going to talk directly to the API at this point, hopefully.
React treats the single quotes versus the double quotes differently?
Nope. I just changed it on my own preference. As I started writing more and more Node, and then I started using Browserify, I sort of switched to single. At first, for me, I was like, I'm going to be cute, and I'm going to use double quotes on the front end and single quotes on the back end, so I always know what the file does. But after you work with Browserify and Node, and you're trying to get them to run as much as possible, like what we're doing right here, you're like, I don't know what that means anymore. It's sort of like, the distinction to me is not so clear anymore. So, this is a really generic, you can think of this like, if you were going to plug jQuery into this Flux architecture, right here is where you would do it, because jQuery has a pretty great Ajax library. But for me, I just load this generic forecast thing, and then I call it get, and inside my forecast thing, like if I open up, you can kind of see what it is. I'm using this library called Super Agent. I'm also setting up a promise. You guys are familiar with, who's familiar with promises? That's most people, that's good. So basically I set up a promise and I hand it back. This is the same basic thing that jQuery Ajax does. I ask forecast for the day. Hey, look, there's that day. So it's going to be today in our case. I tell it I want JSON, and then when it's done, I resolve the promise, sending the information back to me. So that's what this guy's using. This guy's saying, hey, forecast, get me this day, and then I'm going to pass something into the event pipeline. It's this big guy called receive forecast. and I pass it the forecast that I just gave to myself. And this done this is a very Node-y thing, actually. In Node, if you're writing middleware and you have an error, when you call the done or next function, you pass it like any variable at all. It assumes it's an error, and it blows up. And that's actually what happens here. Because I tried for a while to have some code run after I ran after an action was successful, but I realized it thought it was an error every time. Because sometimes I would want to pass, say, the forecast into a callback, but you can't really do that anymore. It just blows up.
Store is busy listening to the event pipeline for.
Yep, that's
Have you
next
grabbed
up.
that? Okay.
So now we're going to talk about the store, which is where all of our data lives. So you can see that this creates store. I'm pulling it from that library I was talking about, Flexible. That means it comes with a bunch of preset stuff, and it reduces the amount of work I have to do. You have to give it a name, otherwise it blows up. And you set up your handlers here. So you can see I have receive forecast. This looks a lot like, the event handlers you would set up in Backbone, if you've ever used it. So I'm going to run the receive forecast function, which is down here at the bottom. And it's really basic. I just I use the day as the key to my object, and I just pop the forecast in there. And then I emit a change. Also, we have this initialize function. You can do this, and that just sets up the default, like your forecast, in my case, my forecasts are an empty object. So I'm going to be putting things in there later, but for now, it's empty. And when I get a forecast, I like returning null, because that makes it a little bit easier. Because if you just return an empty object, it's like, how do I know for sure it's empty? It's kind of, you can't, there are ways around it, but I like null. So, back in our new page, we're basically kicking this thing off now. Like, the party has started. We're going to hit the API. But right now, when the store updates and it emits that change right here, right there, we're not listening to it. So we have a problem. We have to set up a way to do that. Luckily, Flexible has that. They got your back. So up here, we're going to include something. I think that's it. Let's go look. Store mix in. See, I'm stupid. So now we have what's called a mix-in, and I'm going to cover exactly what that is in just a second. Man, okay. Now we're listening to events. Like, it's as easy as that with Flexible. That store mix-in will allow you to attach handlers to all these events that are coming out of your stores. And it's pretty nice, but we have a little bit more we have to do, because obviously you don't want all your components that are listening to stores to listen to every event always. So this syntax is even less appealing to me, but you have this guy here. So we're going to pop this in here and talk about what that means. So as you can see, this is to me this feels like a very different syntax than the one we just used inside the store, and that really makes me mad. But essentially you're setting up a big object of store listeners. And when the forecast store, which I don't have a reference to yet, so I'll need to add it, when that forecast store emits that change event, we are going to tell it to run on store change. And on store change is basically an event handler. All it's going to do is accept that information that something has changed, and then it's going to talk to the store. Because the store is not passing us information through the event, it's just letting us know that information has changed, and you should go update yourself. So we actually need to include the forecast store. Just make sure nothing's broken yet. Everything seems fine. So now we have to make on store change, and this one I like to put down below my lifecycle events. So at this point, all we know is that the store has changed. This could either mean that the day we requested is now available, as in the AJAX response is completed, or something else has happened and the information in the store has changed for some reason. Like there could be some sort of long polling going on where we're updating the weather every once in a while, and we're like, oh, the weather just changed. Like instead of being 59, it's now 58 or whatever. Update yourself.
How do we make sure that we're only carrying in case it's the day that we currently are setting the components to?
Difficult in this arrangement. I'm not going to get into that.
Okay.
No, but the question was, how do you get more? How do you know more granularly what changed in the store? Is that what you was saying?
With this particular setup, it's actually you don't know. Like that's kind of the thing. What React is going to do is just assume, like it's just going to like you don't really. If you're thinking about like this in terms of binding, like that's not particularly important to React. React is just like something changed, re-render everything, more or less. Like they found that is more efficient. Yes.
And that's because it's not re-rendering it directly in DOM, right? They can do that because they virtualized this.
They can diff it quickly because they virtualized it.
Yeah.
So that the way I understand it works is there are two virtual DOM things that just like they do a diff on it. And from that diff, they come up with a series of patches to run on the DOM itself. So it's like there is still the DOM, but
Yeah.
they only manipulate during those patch runs.
But that's why they don't care so much about
Right.
it, right?
Yes.
Exactly.
Because like no element is bound to any information. It's all just yeah. There's no like, hey, you know, your options. If there are now 6 of them, add a pin child to that select thing. That's not really what's happening. What's happening is, hey, nuke that entire element. I got another one. So what was I doing? I forgot. Oh, right. So we have our store change, and again, we're gonna have to start using the terrible syntax of flexible. Oh man, what is it? Can't remember. I'm gonna have to go look. Sorry, guys. See, look at this. Who knew? So, basically, what we're gonna do is, now that we know something has changed, we know we need to update the state for this component. And it's pretty smart about this in that when you set state, you can simply pass only the attributes you really want to update. So when I set the state, I don't have to worry about blowing up day or temperature by not passing them now. I can just throw in whatever I want. In my case, I'm going to name it forecast. And yeah, I just kind of pasted that whole thing in there because we can look at it. Okay, so you remember when we added this store mixin. Store mixin allows us to use get store. You can think of this like, this is more or less how React is going to handle inheritance or sharing functions between different components, is you create mixins. This particular mixin has get store. And the reason this is important is you want Fluxible to manage all this stuff for you. You don't want to think about managing your stores. Like it also, I haven't ever needed to get this fancy, but it can manage, I think, it can limit what certain components are allowed to call as well. I haven't had a need to get that fancy yet, but this is what they're, like this library is what they're rewriting Yahoo Mail in, so I imagine they encounter a lot of very complicated scenarios.
What happens if the store doesn't have what the this.state.date is?
Where? Here?
Yeah.
yeah, so we can go look at Git forecast and I'll talk about it. Wait, did it make sense? Why is it mad at me? Because it's supposed to be an object. Make a mistake, Gulp stops running. That's why it's better than grunt. So anyway, right here at the bottom is my Git forecast guy. In my case, I'm just calling null right now, or I'm returning null. Otherwise, it's going to hit that big list of forecasts, look for something that's saved as the date, and shoot it back to you. And this is not, like, this is the big problem I had at first, is that this cannot be an asynchronous request. Like, this happens right then. Like, it's happening right now. Do it live. So, once this set state happens, React knows it needs to re-render itself. So, we can do something fun, maybe. Actually, I need to go look like what the data actually looks like. I don't remember. Here we go. We can do something kind of simple. So, what we're going to do, yeah, I'm calling everything forecast, that's bad. It's too generic. This is the stuff you spend hours worrying about. Like, what are my variables named? I worry about it more than I worry about naming my kid. Okay, so basically I'm going to offload this into something called render forecast. And what I'm going to have this do is, if I don't have a forecast, it's going to say something like loading. So once I do, it's going to be so fast though, hopefully if it works. So if there is no forecast, it's going to do something like say, hey, we're loading your forecast. If I do have it, I'm just going to spit out something that proves it's there. So, real simple.
Could intentionally introduce a sleep or something.
No.
No.
I have no idea how to do that in Go. No, I'm just kidding. What I'll probably do is just break it. Okay, so we have our forecast, which we set in our state. Actually, here's a good time to add this. If we're going to talk to it, we don't know for sure it's there, which is where get initial state comes in. Because we probably, I'm going to go ahead and set that guy up as just being an empty object. That way, when we call it, we're not exactly like no, we don't want to do that at all, do we? Ha! That makes more sense. Okay, so if our forecast equals null, whatever, we're just going to go ahead and return here's a good time to introduce a JavaScript X. JSX gotcha. You can't do this. You can't. You have to always, and this is like, I think, something that drives me crazy. You always have to nest. And if you think about the JavaScript it compiles to, it kind of makes sense, because you can't just have this text floating out there. Like, sure, it represents a text node, but what is that in HTML? React has no idea. So you have to wrap it in something like paragraph tag, span tag, whatever. And you have to keep in mind that every single one of these you're using, they've created in their virtual DOM. So this isn't automated in any way. It's terrible. So you can also do things like that. So if you want to use like an HTML entities thing, like you can do that sort of thing, but some of them don't exist, so good luck. So you can actually, I'm going to show you what this looks like, and then I'll show you how to fix it. Else return. So if we do have a forecast, we're just going to go ahead and spit out a paragraph that contains this is where actually probably manipulating the data becomes handy, because you're going to see how crazy this gets in a little bit. We're going to start coming after this data in here. Oh, it's going to look, the syntax, like, it's going to be so ugly. All right, anyway. I'm going to go ahead and probably comment this out for now, because I want to show you guys the loading stage. So what I just commented out, in case you missed it, was the code that runs when the store updates. So that's the point at which our component gets the data. So I'm turning that off for now because I want to show you how bad I can break it. Oops. Okay, this might work. It didn't work. Oh, wait. Anyway. Actually, I'm gonna put it in template maybe. That's pretty good. Now you can do this though, because this is still like, though it's not nested, it's still nested in this main guy. Incidentally, that main is probably the closest. That main's HTML5, right? That's the closest we're gonna get to HTML5 today. There it is. So you can see it is now loading this, and oh my god, I think they updated. Oh, they updated. Okay, so this is sweet. In older versions of React, these guys would be bumped up together because React didn't interpret those carriage returns. So you would have to, if you wanted to do something like this, because in normal HTML, right, it interprets that carriage return as a space. In it, you used to have to do, and it figures out how to do this, but it's so ugly. Just watch. Since it's going to be wild, you're going to like this.
It's actually
Oh no, they fixed this too. Okay, React has gotten so much better, guys. While I've been sitting here. So anyway, but we can just change this to just for fun. So, boom, now we have our loading state, and now I'm going to show you how badly I've broken it by turning our data request back on. Actually, yeah, you can see I've broken something horribly over here. You'll find out more about that in one moment. No, you think I'm already on console. Okay. Oh, I think that's not related to my app. Okay, I broke something, guys. I'm so sorry. Okay, let's go through. No. Also, while I figure out what I just broke, you can see React likes to spit out all these little recommendations. So it's mad at me right now. This is not the error, but when you don't include a key and you're rendering an array, it's going to shout at you because for some reason I don't actually know why. So if I want to like remove that error, I can come in here and make the key this, and it should be pretty happy. Yeah, it's gone now. So we're clearly having problems loading. Sorry guys, this is what happens when I decide to wing it. I definitely went through and wrote like way too much code without checking to make sure any of it was working. Let's look over at my big guy and see what I'm missing.
server still running?
Should be. Actually, what I'm hitting is this. That's a problem, maybe. Okay. Alright, it's kind of back. I just broke something. Okay, guys, it seems like this is actually completely my fault. Alright, I think my listener's set up incorrectly. I just have to figure out exactly how.
Is it on change or is it on store change? So I was looking at some examples from Yahoo and there's
Yeah, so the reason I didn't name it on change is because that is also it's a prop you can like associate events with. So if I were to add them later, then it would be really weird.
I
So
just
it's-
wanted to be sure that was something you could name yourself and that wasn't some convention they had.
Did you add anything in the forecast store? Or did you do inside the store forecast file?
I think that's working okay. I didn't write into that right now. So it's my new stuff that's broken. Yeah, okay, something, I'm not listening to it.
Makes sense? Does it make sense?
It's something to do with mixing, yeah.
No, but I mean the word mix ends.
Yeah.
Oh, did I pluralize something?
Yeah,
Yeah, there, you need
Wait,
to
wait,
S
wait.
on the end of mix, it needs to be mixed ends.
Thanks, man.
Yeah.
Save my bacon.
Wow.
You're wrong.
Well, then blame Yahoo, because that's what's in their example.
Yeah, it is supposed to be mixed. What the heck?
Just keep walking.
Could do the cooking show magic and cut to the finish out.
I could. It's so much more complex, but it works.
This is what it's like.
Is your order of requires, does that matter?
No, it does not. That kind of gets translated to this really, if you look at the code that becomes, you'll sort of be like, that kind of looks like AMD a little bit. It's really just a way to reference different parts of your giant bundle. So the order doesn't matter exactly. But I've broken something, guys. I'm so sorry. I don't know what I did.
What is the done function?
So the done function, that's a way to, if I wanted to, let's see, right here, where I do this execute action, I could pass in a callback, like that, and it would receive an error. So only when something goes wrong do you really need to pass something to done. Because you can see here I'm passing an action, a big object of information, which they call a payload, and then the function which gets called, which is done. And you can see that here in the load forecast action. You have context, payload, and done, which it's the same three things you pass here. So they have it set up where if it's undefined, you won't blow up your app. But I definitely screwed something up. And there are like 100 things it could be. So I just have to track it down. Actually, let's just make sure the rest of the app is working. Yeah, the rest of the app is fine. That was my loading screen, by the way, that flickered. You see that? That was loading. It's so fast. Yeah, so I don't think, I'm just gonna have to dig it up, guys.
What was
So-
that mix in? Go back to your mix in array.
So this is my mix in.
Yeah, that looks.
And I'm going to show you the one that works.
Sure.
So here's my store mix-in, which I include as mix-ins. The get day mix-in is not important since I'm hard coding it, as you recall. here I've called it on store change. I get the forecast store.
Why is it flexible app?
I don't know. It annoys me that they named it that. It has, Flexible may have just been taken on NPM, and that's why they went with Flexible app. Actually, I'm not even sure that's the case.
It says that that's deprecated.
Well, what?
Yeah, if you,
Well, this stuff's been on my computer for a little bit. I mean, it's working okay in one spot. I've just broken something.
I mean, that's, yeah.
Very obviously true. Well, this is annoying, guys. I'm sorry.
Well, no, it's a chance to learn. Like, how do you think about, you know, don't worry about it. What would you do if this happened to your dad? What's the kind of things that how do you think about
Well,
where to start on
you saw me
something?
sort of like step through the code, so I know that I'm missing my listener. I know that that's where the disconnect is. I just got to go ahead and figure out why that is. Because I got all the way through to the store right here. And down here, I got to the receive forecast. What's up? Did I-
On line 7, you're supposed to pass it in straight.
Yes. This is part of the stuff I hate, because it's like different from how you attach the listeners inside the component itself, you know. But it gets the job done most of the time. It's not right now, is it? I'm gonna blame my tool, not me. So what we're doing, we're listening to the mix in.
So is that a common problem that if you run into a JavaScript error in a browser, that it's really hard to isolate what it's actually complaining about?
I wish we did out here.
Sublime had some kind of a red highlight on the file you were currently at.
Yeah,
If you
it's
go
gonna
up.
have a bunch of those. That guy
Yeah.
it's looking at it and it thinks it's JavaScript. So it's trying to tell me that, what is that, dude? It doesn't know that I'm using JSX in the middle of it.
Say you don't change function.
Are there any JSX aware editors?
I'm assuming there probably is stuff inside. For Sublime, I just,
So it's returning today.
yeah, I know, right? This guy. So the receive forecast thing is working for the store itself. There it is.
Because you could just step inside that.
Is that how you normally do it? I always get afraid. Because you can never know where you're going to go. It's like, oh, where am I? Because it's not a great way to.
step inside, yeah.
Nah, it's too late now. I missed it.
We can turn this presentation into debugging 101.
Yeah, we're gonna rip this apart. So I'm emitting my change. Oh, I'm screwing something else up. And remember, I didn't write this forecast store right here. So the problem is clearly with my page. I just had to figure out what it is. It's gonna be something so stupid, guys. That's what it's gonna be. It's gonna be like semicolon. It's gonna be one of those. The problem is there's just not a lot happening. You should just call this. Oh.
you have the solution app? You want to maybe walk through some of the talk?
No, it's been set. Just making stupid. Here. Well, I think it's being set. I'm just being. Oh my god. I'm so sorry, everyone.
Just post what the solution is like.
No, it's been set. I'm just. Wait.
So refresh your code.
Yeah, I was too fast. Let's be here.
One more thing.
What do you do by your statement right then?
So, yeah, this is actually probably a good case for the React DevTools, which I'm not using. So you can see the four guys is in here. For some reason, I've broken something else. We assumed it was the request. I think it's something completely different.
Well, I noticed when you're looking at this state, there's not a method on this pointer. In the debugger.
Right here?
Well, whenever you were debugging it, if you look at this pointer, you don't see a set state.
So right there on the store change. That would be unusual.
Look through this one, like in your watch.
Well, that's because it's in the prototype, probably, right? Now here's what I'll do. So I think the error is actually in here. Yeah, it's in here. I'm doing something stupid here.
No, we didn't like that ampersand. The thing that was.
Wait, what? Oh, this? Like maybe. I mean, it seems to be having.
Yeah.
It seems to render it okay.
Is your state object?
Oh, it's working. Magic.
What'd you do?
Nothing. I think we all just got really caught up in the debugger. We're like, oh, it started working at some point. Oh, look at that. That's amazing. React, everyone. So now we could like play with it, actually. Uh-oh, now I have 1,000 debuggers on the thing. Let's see, now it's starting to pull any data. I'm so sorry.
But if we had not had fixed your mix-ins issue, we would have been back at the drawing board again.
That was it. Maybe that was it. We just didn't notice it got fixed afterward. Third one, install React DevTools. Don't be like me.
Don't be like this, me.
Yeah.
So how did React work with like shallow DOMs or anything for web components? Can you actually add that inside of the template or is that more?
So are you talking about like I've written my own custom, custom HTML5 element sort of thing?
Yeah, that or like if you want to catch a shallow DOM since you're not working with the actual DOM.
I haven't really dealt with the shadow DOM much, so I can't speak to that. But I'm sort of interested in the web components thing. React can't really do that. It's sort of like, sorry, technically you can name your components whatever you want, but what it kind of comes down to is it's never going to be a custom name because it has to turn into something that React knows how to sort of render. So you can name it like, this is my cool time selector, but in the end it comes down to being the HTML inside that component. So as far as getting to like custom elements, I'm not sure it's a fantastic option.
Does this sit inside like the index.html and you have the style sheets and stuff at the top?
Yes, I will show it to you now. I don't actually have a view engine in my website. I'm not using Jade or regular HTML or anything. I actually just use React. So I have an HTML component, so-called. And since you asked, I'm going to show it to you. You can see this is where I can pull in my CSS, some other stupid stuff. Here's where this only gets run, this component only gets run on the server. So in React, if you want to just pipe in raw HTML to something, you have to do it through this crazy syntax. Dangerously set inner HTML. Don't do it, stop. And it has to look like this. So when I render a bunch of components on the server, and then I pass it to my HTML component, Like that's what this .process.markup is. We're gonna get to that eventually, unless I keep bringing it up. And we'll get to this part as well, because you can see I'm also dangerously setting into HTML. And this is also my bundle. That's where everything from my Gulp file goes. So that's what it looks like. So there is no real view engine. There's just React, which was one of my objectives when I was playing with this. It's like, get Jade or whatever comes with Express, the server I'm running, whatever comes with it by default. I'm just going to go only React. Yes.
But you said that's running to the server side?
Yes. I can dig in that now if you'd like. So, when you read the title of the talk, you're probably like, isomorphic application. What is that? Basically, they've stolen, JavaScript developers have stolen the word isomorphic from the mathematics community. And it doesn't mean anything anymore outside them. I'm not a math dude, so I don't know what isomorphic is really.
Like the inverse of shape.
There you go.
Gotcha.
So is this app that? No, not really. I think what they did was they looked at the Greek root. They're like, oh, it's the same shape or equal shape or whatever. They're like, hey, that's what this is, kind of. But I don't know. The name's not great.
I think it has to do with being able to use the same APIs across the server and client.
That is what it really means. Yes.
Well, in the JavaScript sense, or in the.
Yep. You can hit up if you want. You can hit up. I hope I. Nope. I'm not on the internet.
Oh, behind you.
I don't have time for that. 30 minutes debugging my application. This is basically a chunk of. In Express, you can like. Has anybody ever dealt with Express or Node? So you kind of know the concept of middleware.
Yeah.
So I've just like jammed some stuff into the middleware here. Instead of using like the official sort of, I guess I kind of am, using the official Express routes. You can, like, none of these are actually set up for the page we're on yet, but you can see right here, that's the same code as we were executing inside our component. It's that execute action load forecast. That's the same thing. Like, it goes and it does essentially the same thing. I pull a little trick to have them hit different endpoints, but for the most part, that's it. Because I mean, if you look at our routes client, it is forecast day, right? You see the same thing here, forecast day on the server. So in the same way, our server is able to construct the same payload that we need to pass. In this case, not super complex because it's just day. And I could definitely see a situation where this becomes problematic, because if you look at this, it's based entirely on like this nested callback thing. On the server, you can actually, when you execute, this is one of the things Flux does for you, when you execute an action in the server, you can actually run a callback without an error. So you can do that server side, which is where I call the next piece of server software, right? And that's actually where I render everything. Because what I want to do in this step is based on the route you're hitting. So if you're hitting forecast today, I want to load that forecast into a store on the server and then render everything after it's done. So what that means is, for load forecast, some of you may have noticed, at the very top in my require, I'm pulling in app data forecast.server, but I've been running this on the client, right? So what exact, like, and I showed you the client-side version first. So let's look at server.js. And there actually is a Yahoo library that does this for you, but it's confused the heck out of me, so I just did this. You can see they're almost identical, and I'm using the same JavaScript library to run both requests. But localhost port 8000, that's my API where I'm getting all my weather forecasts from. And in the app I'm working on, this will be where I talk to Dark Skies API. Like, that's where I'll run that. They're similar since it's the same the same library, but here's the client-side one where I hit the API endpoint on the server I'm running my JavaScript on. So I'm actually using two servers. It's sort of mostly to illustrate a point, because like let's say you're an enterprise and you're like, I have a company with a sweet API and I want to build sweet applications on top of it. Here in your server-side version, that's where you talk to your company's API. So your Node app is separate now from your company's API or backend or whatever it was. Now your Node server is basically also your front end. Like they're sort of all mashed up together. And really, this is the only dividing line between what runs on the server and what runs on the client. They both have the same sort of syntax. So you just do forecast.get and you can pass it a day. They behave the same way. That way, when they're running different environments, you don't even know. Now, how I pull this off, like, hey, how do you make sure one only ever runs in the client, is in my Gulp file, I use this thing called aliasify. And all that does is say, when you're bundling this and you make a request for forecast.server, actually load in the one for the client. So I just pull the switcheroo. Since the APIs are the same, it doesn't know ever. And that's how I trick it into doing what I want. Shoot. So, man, I forget what you asked a question, right?
No,
Who has a question?
I said you were running it on the server and you answered my question.
Yeah, that got, wow. That went pretty far afield, sorry. So yeah, that's the server. As you can see, we don't actually have a route right now for what we're doing. So we could potentially add one. So what did I call it? I call it new. So now, when someone hits new, we can just, since I'm hard coding it, we can just do this, and it should work. And I'll show you how you know it works. Yeah, so this nasty thing, that is a representation of my my data stores that gets spat out to my front end, and then my various applications can pick up on it. It's actually not working yet, because you can see I still have this loading state, and the idea is to nix that. We don't want to have a loading state, since we're already making the call on the server to populate the data. We don't really need to. And that's because, probably, my implementation is too stupid at the moment. So, that seems to be working. It's pulling in the data. So, what we need to do now is head over to our new page. And let's see. So, remember that in the lifecycle, when this thing gets mounted, I'm having it call the action. Same action we literally just called on the server at this point. So if, let's see. So we're going to check the forecast store for our forecast to see if we have it. Because if it's in there, we don't actually want to run it. We don't actually want, we bail out. So if we check the, whoop, no, that's right. No, that's right. If it's empty, if it's that. So if it's got something in there, in this case, I return null. So if it's null, we'll hopefully bail out, and we won't run the action that makes the request, which technically is going to be a double request.
How does it know to pull that data without, and when it changes, that it's subscribed to actually pull that? Is that all that get initial state? do, or why does it then update the component to redraw if we don't make the call?
Okay, so how this is working is you're going to get your initial state. React is going to render the component to the DOM. Then this guy gets called. Component didn't mount. Based on the React docs recommendation, that's where I put my action calls. So that all just kind of happens automatically as part of the lifecycle of the component. And then we have our listener set up here that knows when the forecast has changed. And then we call our generic function, sets the state, and really setting the state is what triggers the re-rendering. But to your question, we have to put this here now. And you remember it returns null if there's nothing in there. So, like, think about what this is doing. When we're getting our initial state, we're now asking the forecast store for the data that has already been loaded into the application through that big nasty blob that I showed you. So it's already in there, actually. So by the time we get here, one, we already have a forecast, and two, we know that we have the forecast we want. That's sort of stupid implementation, but because I don't know, like, well, maybe something changed, right? But this is, for the sake of this example, is pretty good. Let's make sure I didn't break anything. All right, it seems to be working. I broke something. Oh, yeah, so let's see, that'll happen.
Oh, yeah.
Well, no, that should be fine. And there you can see we're now avoiding that loading blip. It doesn't show up anymore because we're not, and you can see down here we're not logging any of our cross-site or XHR requests. I mean, if I took this out, I think it should still run. Might maybe blow up. Yeah, there it is. You can see it ran, but you can't actually detect that something went wrong. I mean, that's wrong, but it's the same data coming back, so it doesn't look wrong. But since we already have the data getting spit out here, we don't really want to run the request a second time. And I can show you how this happens. I have another piece on my server. What did I call it? So I have another piece of middleware. This is what happens after I execute any stores I need to, depending on your request route. And this is where the rendering actually takes place. This is that next step. When I called next before in the last piece, this is what happens next. You can see it's the same router that I use client side. So I'm just running the same routes again. And I'm getting, that's my React handler. So that's, you know, the app.jsx, which contains my new page.jsx. And React wants you to do this now. They didn't used to. But you have to, like, if you want to call a React element like that, like in regular JavaScript, they want you to wrap it in a React.createFactory. You used to be able to just be like element open close parentheses and it would run, but not anymore. They keep changing stuff like that. So this is response.send, and basically that's where I say, hey server, give this back to people. This is a new guy here. That's rendered to static markup. And I showed you earlier all those React data ID junk that it pumps into your HTML. That prevents that from happening. So when so your HTML won't have like data React ID or whatever, because it doesn't need it, because we're not going to re-render the HTML wrapper again. And then right here you can see, hey look, there's window.app. Then I basically serialize, and this flat thing, that's Fluxable. That's the Yahoo library. I'm using it here to run a function called dehydrate on a context that I set up earlier. And remember, this context thing is everywhere. So this is another way of using that to associated with all the stores it needs to then dehydrate, so-called. And 1 second, so I'm about to finish this thought. If you look at forecast, you can see it has a dehydrate function. So that is how it knows what to do. And in my instance of Fluxible, I've registered my app store. So Fluxible knows every store I have in my application. So it knows about all of them. So when it comes time to run dehydrate, it just goes through them and it runs dehydrate on each. And that result is what gets spit out into this blob here. Okay, question, go.
Just a question. So in this example, you're dehydrating these stores into a blob that's sent over, and then on client side, these lifecycle methods are running and building the view. Do you have a choice also to run those lifecycle methods server side so that you just get a completed view that comes down?
Some of them do. Like, that is basically what's happening.
Okay.
When I render them here, some of them run. Get initial state, for example, will run. Component did mount will not run. And that has to do with, where is it? Here we go. React.render to string. When you do that, it knows you're not going to render it to the DOM. So it doesn't do everything. So it'll never fire, component did mount, which is great for me because that would be an Ajax request at this point, which would make no sense. So what you want to do, like, when you call that render to string, it's going to do things like get initial state, get default props, and it's going to go through and act more or less like it's on the browser, but skipping a good chunk of the lifecycle events.
So you don't pick and choose, like it
You
takes
cannot.
the, okay.
And then right now.
Okay.
I don't know if you will be later.
Yeah.
So that's render to string. And now I'm going to talk about React.render. There's only one in my entire app. So, wow, where did I even put it? I don't even remember. So, right here is, you can see I just punched that, sorry. Breaking your brand new stuff. Right here is where we bring our data in and we render. And this is, you'll remember this is the root of my JavaScript application. This is where things bootstrap. So you can see here that I get that flexible application again. This is the same, this is the very same as the one I'm talking to right here in my server side stuff. What I want to do here though is I call, instead of dehydrate, I'm going to call rehydrate. And I pass it window.app, because you'll remember here in run, that's where I wrote all my information to. So it's super smart, and it knows that it knows to read that stuff, which is this giant blob over here. You can see window.app equals I'm a huge blob. It knows to read that and turn it into your stores. So it brings that information in, and it's magic after that. After 3 days of working on it, you can have magic. Then we're going to do a few other things. These routes, that's that stuff I showed you earlier. Still have it open. These are my routes. I'm just telling my app about it. Same way I told my server about it. And so that's how it knows to get me the correct React element, which I then pass to React.render instead of render to string or render to static markup. Render is where you say, hey you, go there. So anytime it detects, and you can see here router.history location, anytime the URL changes, or there's a history event, I guess, it's going to do this. It's going to run this function, this callback in here. So that means it's going to, it doesn't really render, I don't think it really re-renders the whole thing, but it uses this document get element ID app to know where to insert itself. And you can see in HTML JSX that I have the ID app here. So that's sort of where I wanted to write. And this is kind of neat because it behaves the same way server side and client. And yeah, that is how we are rendering it out. So far I've been building a single page application for you guys. Right now I'm going to go ahead and pull my big trick. I'm going to disable JavaScript, turn it off, and fingers crossed, it still works. Still works. Right now I have no functionality on it, but it still works. So it knows what to render, and it doesn't behave. Like, I have JavaScript off right now, and I can still like look through my entire app because that's the way this is supposed to go.
So you're doing a postback every time when you were switching?
From what I understand, a postback to be, yes. What happens
Post
is
the server asking for the next page.
yeah. So what's happening is it runs through my React middleware, right? And it does everything it did to render the HTML the first time, and do the handoff, everything. It thinks I'm handing it off to the JavaScript, but I just have JavaScript turned off.
Because you're doing the stuff on the server side to do that. Okay.
Right, and there's parity between, like in my more full example, when I flip through the days here.
Actually changing routes so you get.
Right. So, but there's parity between my client-side router and my server-side router. So their behavior is essentially the same in this scenario. Now I can't actually do this. I like before I had a button in here that would let me do it, but I took it out. So now I'm here. So drop your phone. So it can do some. You can see it's very mad at me. So it can do some pretty sweet stuff. Now I think we should go ahead and let's attach an event listener to our select thing. So let's pretend that's actually wrong, right? Yeah. Let's pretend we have a list of hours like we have in the main app. I'm gonna close all this stuff, excuse me. So when we make our array, let's start with 0. This is now running, midnight through 5. Uh-oh, now you know that I didn't pay for Sublime. Awkward. So, what we're going to do now is make it behave like my bigger weather app, and we're going to have this select box that you change it and basically get the forecast to it. So this is going to show you how to add basically an event handler to React. So, and this I think is probably the biggest PR mistake they made, was this. So this, you know what this looks like, right? This looks exactly like I'm attaching, old school inline JavaScript behavior to this element, instead of like doing it the cool way where it's all abstracted and separate. So people hated this when they first saw it, and people still hate it. And when people see it for the first time, they still think it's dumb. So I think they maybe should have come up with a better way to do this, but I'm not sure. When you think about what JSX really compiles to, you don't have such a gross reaction to it, because this is just like a property on an object you're passing to a function, and then you can just be happy that they maintain what this is. Something like that. I think that should work. Yeah, that's gonna work. So now we have to create a function call on hour change, because we're interested in when the hour changes. I'm gonna put it above my rendered junk. Dangerously close to my store listener. Now, I've seen people handle this a bunch of different ways, like, how do I know what does what? Some people will do things like this, to make them know that this is not directly related to the other class of event handlers, but for me, I don't care. I'm just one guy. So, now I'm going to get to show you what React does with the events. And it's a little bit different. So you can see here that it's this weird synthetic event thing. And jQuery does a similar thing to their events. They wrap it in this nice thing that makes it pretty. They're doing a similar thing here, but this means that you don't really have to worry about different implementations of the DOM and all this other junk, and you can just talk directly to. Actually, this is a weird thing. I've noticed this. I'm using Canary. I've noticed that everything like comes through null. It's not actually null, but when Canary spits it out right now, it just does it.
Getter, is it?
What's up?
Is it because the synthetic event of define getter and
Yeah,
it doesn't actually populate unless you call it?
Well, doesn't Chrome actually spit those out though? Here.
I think if you're debugging a define getter property, you won't, because you have to actually use the property in order for it.
Okay. I thought I saw.
Populate it, so.
All right. Well, anyway, don't trust the console. Lesson here. So we know what the target was. It was our little select dude down here, way down here now, and he's going to have a new value now, and that value is the hour that we wish to change, the hour we wish to use for our power switching weather thing. I don't know what to call it. You can see it's coming through now. So now that we have it, now you remember that it won't, since I don't care anymore. Why not? So now that we've added this, right, we've added a new thing to the state, we gotta come here, make sure it exists, all this fun stuff. So let's see if I can show you that bug. And as you can see, it has the weird bug now because it won't actually let you change it until you set it, because it's based on the state. So you actually have to update the state to get the select box to reflect what you just clicked, which I think seems a little cumbersome. So, doing another one of these, as in the hour. Let's see,
What would be different from that than just setting the value in the state? What does set state do?
Well, they ask you not to do that in the docs. So you could directly access it and change it, but that's going to break lifecycle, I think, of your component.
Oh, so it like triggers another event.
Yeah, so if you call set state and pass it in properties, it knows that it needs to like kick off a bunch of those lifecycle events. I think if you skip it, hey, let's try it. I mean, whatever, right? We'll see what happens. Whatever. Actually, we're gonna actually help this. Okay. You might yell at us even. I think it worked. Interesting. Well, let's make sure this works. It probably doesn't. No, yeah, it's just broken in general. Yeah. Oh, wait. What? Oh, this might make a difference. Probably not. There we go. So now I'm gonna give it an extra try. Yeah, let's see if we break it. Man, you refresh too much. Yeah, I guess it just doesn't even work. It's kind of weird. I would expect it to at least work. I guess it's just
Didn't
not.
you say that set state actually triggers the
Yeah, I'm guessing
render?
that has to be what it is. It's
Yeah.
not, because when you set the state, it knows that you can change what the selected option in your select Dropbox is, but without going that way, it's like I don't know what's happening.
Would need to trigger the repay.
Hmm?
It wouldn't even trigger the repay.
I think it is.
Print out an alert.
Print out what on alert? I mean, I think we know we're changing it.
You could actually get that to work if you, because when you define your state, you can actually use the define setter method. And then inside the define setter, you can actually call this set state and just pass in the property. So that you actually could do this set hour and would end up calling this set state on the state object.
Yes. That sounds good to me. But I think keep it normal for now. Alright, so you can see we're changing it. And now the next thing we need to do is pull out the correct hour and pull out the correct weather. And I don't remember at all what the forecast data actually looks like. So you can see we've got like this hourly thing. So we have to, it's gonna look nasty. I just wrote that, I don't remember what it was. Pretty bad. So, what we'll do, I think this will be the last thing we do. If we have a forecast, we'll go ahead and we're going to spit out something about the current hour. If we don't, I don't know. If we don't, we'll just return, no forecast data. It's less of, you can tell that it's less of a risk now that we're actually doing a handoff between server and client. It's less of a risk, but it still happens when you transition from one sort of controller view to another, because you will be in a state where you don't have your updated stuff. That bites me all the time. So we'll just go ahead and spit out something simple. It's gonna be really long because I haven't formatted what comes back from the API at all. Nice. Actually, I think it's gonna get mad at me. Let's see. You can also do this, but you have to do that. That's the trick. Oh.
So React expects you to close all tags?
Yes. Unless it's changed. Like I said, I'm surprised by so much. Wow, look at that sweet weather report.
Your Gulp blew up earlier than we didn't close your p-tagging. So.
No, it's still running. I think it's okay. I think what's happening right here is I actually have to reference what I want. What do I want, guys? I'm gonna spit out temperature. That sounds fun.
Summary.
Maybe the summary and temperature? Yeah, we do it. I'm open. Normally I do this, figure out what the heck is going on instead of these giant blocks of junk. Okay, so summary we said? Summary, survey sets. There we go. You saw that the server was actually up to date before my client was, so I got the correct one. And then split second later. Actually, here you go. Here's the problem I was talking about earlier. There's no breaking space between the two of them. Don't know why I didn't get it to work earlier. But now you can see the problem. Oh yeah, here's another thing. Whenever you just leave stuff out in the open like this is like a bare text node, you're gonna get it wrapped in a span. That's how React handles it, because it is technically nesting it and stuff, but it's not gonna yell at you. So I think we can do something like this, and that bug I told you existed. Ah, come on. Okay, there it is. Put the space in there. Boom, there's that bug I said existed. Totally does. So now we should be able to just change the weather. Doesn't even matter. And it's basically just a poor man's version of my fancier one. I think that should be it. I've talked for way too long. Does anybody have more questions?
One question, with respect to your code, if you don't mind. In this block here, when you're rendering out, are you able to use like a ternary conditional within JSX or JHX?
Yeah, I use
Instead
them all
of
over the
having-
place in
okay.
my more complicated example, but since I decided to like
Sure.
toss all that, I thought it was like a little bit simpler just to say if we're gonna do this, but yeah, you can
Okay.
use them here. Do not use them. You cannot use them, say, inside JSX like this, unless you get really careful.
Okay.
So this could, like each of these, I could say like return and then give you a ternary, right? Which has each of these, but I couldn't put it inside what's
okay.
going to be interpreted.
So does
You
the-
can in some situations, but it really depends on what you're doing. Like if you're going to set a prop, like if I'm setting blah or something, like this value or something,
Mhm.
I think that'd be a bad idea. But you could put a ternary there, inside those braces.
So the parser, it's pretty much JavaScript until it runs into what looks like an HTML tag, and that's what
Yeah.
kicks in
Yeah, so
the X
I think a good way to think about this is each of these are gonna end up like this is gonna end up looking more like this is gonna be like on change, blah, and value is blah, right? With select here and whatever else. And then, etc. down here. So you can't really swap out that, it doesn't like you to swap out that text piece with a ternary. That's how you can think about it. You can, it just gets confused. It will not work. So, you can't say use it like right here to determine if I'm using a P or,
Okay.
It could be inside the school district.
where?
Like
Yes.
inside of the school district.
Down here, yes. Maybe we could look at this some. I think this might work. Yeah, so that can work. But let's see. So I think this works. There are times when it breaks though. I'm trying to remember when it is. And that's fine. Looks good. This will be regular. Yeah, so I guess you can do that. I'm just remembering what you can't do. But there is some time where you're going to want to use a ternary and be like, I can't do it, why not? I just don't remember exactly when. So yeah, look at this sweet app.
Could you tell us a little bit about if you have any recommendations or opinions on how you should structure your directories and applications if you're going to do an isomorphic app like this?
Don't do that. I don't use Symfony. I'm cool. Where am I keeping this? I don't remember. You can kind of see. Here it is. I'm kind of weird about this because I really like being I think I have an edge case opinion on this. But you see how I'm able to say require app stores forecasts? I really like being able to do that.
Yeah.
When you start reading Node, you'll see things like this all over the place.
Right.
I hate that. So I've started keeping my Node modules. This is my app. I keep it inside node modules. You can like, you can also like do like, you know, like a symlink or something.
Just don't npm install the app module.
Yes. So you could probably name it something pretty unique. But that's kind of how I do it. I've never came across the app module.
I'm sure there is one, but
Probably.
yeah, just don't type it because it'll wipe
Yeah.
out your app module.
And I know it feels weird even to me, but once you set it up and you start, you get like the benefit of being able to require modules the way that I'm doing it. Like I feel pretty happy about it. And technically I got this advice from Substack. So I think Substack wrote Browserify, so I'm like, whatever, I'll just do it.
So then if your app is inside node modules, how do you handle it from like within a repo? Because usually
I'll
we'll
show you.
ignore node modules.
With this one cool trick. Right there.
Yeah.
So I ignore every directory inside node modules except for one. And that's how you check it in. And if you notice on GitHub, you can now ignore empty directories, so it's very easy to just go into your app. That's how I do it. I'm terrible, I know. But my overall structure, you can see, is pretty generic right now. In a larger app, I'm not exactly sure how to go. So you can see I made an about page. So for me, I've named the page. I think I'm probably not going to do that in the future.
Sure.
But, you know, writer's block. Every time I have what Facebook would consider a controller view, I name it page. So that's the big boy that does all the logic. And then my more generic ones like app, HTML, and nav, I just have in the root, which is probably not the best place. But you know, it's pretty standard. Like actions, components, those are my data services, right? And these two guys don't have a home.
But index is what you're running your node server in, right?
Yeah. Because I think I probably do something super cool over here. Let's see, JS. No, I know. I mean, I can theoretically. No, I couldn't. Yeah. So sometimes I've named index.js like right here. Sometimes I've named that bundle or seeing things main. I don't know if there's like a good standard. Yeah. Then I have my middleware, which runs on my server. And the mixins, which are client side. Routes, which are both. And then my one store. So that's sort of how I put it together. I used. Notice I didn't actually use this at all. 6 to 5 in my talk. I used the Express site generator when I first created this.
Right.
What's up?
Was it Yeoman?
Nah, Express has their own.
Okay.
But it is essentially. It's the same thing. So it puts like app.js here. Oh, I can actually read this. That's one downside of JSX is you open it, it's like, I don't know what this is. Also, funny thing, the language composition thing in GitHub is completely screwed up. It says no idea what a JSX file is still. So it's my project is mostly CSS, as it turns out.
Is that not something you can contribute to GitHub? Isn't there some?
Screw them. But the way they do it is they have this, like when you generate the site, they have this bin www, and that's, if you look at my package.json, look at I have a bunch of scripts I set up. Well, one in particular that I'm using right now. I use Nodeline to watch for changes, and the annoying thing about Nodeline is you have to, like, if you change what you want to watch, you have to specify everything you want to watch. So I was like, well, I want to watch when there are changes inside the Node Modules app. That means you have to specify that you also want to watch for changes at the root. It's super annoying. And if you want to watch for changes on JSX, you have to specify that you want to watch changes on .js. So I like Node Modules. So that's how I structure it. I don't know if it's good.
It works.
Yeah.
It's it only works because I have the quick completion for Sublime. And I kind of know where everything goes. I mean, this is just for me. So